In September 1873, while Bitter Creek's homesteaders prepared for winter, Nicole Wren hired the town drunk. Only that man would work for a woman. All summer, Thomas dug stone and built walls as the town mocked. Skeptics called it a waste. But when a January blizzard froze the valley solid, Nicole's farm was the only one still functional, and the staggering revelation of Thomas's true skill left the village begging for their help. Nicole Wren was a widow with 160 acres of stubborn soil and a half-built cabin, trying to survive in a valley where no one believed a woman could run a farm alone. Thomas was the man everyone crossed the street to avoid, a drinker who slept in the livery stable and hadn't held a steady job in years. Their partnership was the joke of Bitter Creek. While neighbors stacked firewood and sealed their homes, Nicole paid Thomas in warm meals to haul stone and dig trenches through the summer heat. People laughed. They said she was throwing good money after bad. But Nicole saw something behind his red-rimmed eyes, a steady patience when he touched the stone, and she wagered everything on a question no one else thought to ask. What if the town drunk was the only man in the valley who actually knew what he was doing? Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1873, was a valley that had already buried too many dreamers before their second winter. The Homestead Act had drawn families westward with promises of free land, but the government never mentioned what the plains wind could do to a wooden cabin when the mercury fell below zero. 3 years earlier, a brutal winter had killed half the livestock in the county. The year after that, a widow named Sarah Crane and her 2 children froze to death inside their own kitchen because the snow drifted so high it blocked the chimney and suffocated the fire. Survivors learned quickly that preparation was not optional. It was religion. By the first week of September, every family with any sense was already stacking firewood, sodding cabin walls, and hoarding whatever grain they could spare. Nobody built stone walls in September. Nobody except a woman who had nothing left to lose. Nicole Wren had buried her husband, John, the previous spring after a fever took him in 3 days. He left her with 160 acres of hard-baked soil, a half-built cabin, and a mortgage payment due to the Cheyenne Bank by the end of the year. She was 29 years old, with no children, no brothers, and no family money to fall back on. In Bitter Creek, a woman alone on a claim was considered a temporary problem. Either she would sell the land for pennies or marry whichever man could keep the roof from collapsing. Nicole refused to do either. She had been raised on a farm in Minnesota before the war, and she understood something that most of the valley men overlooked. Winters were not fought with muscle alone. They were fought with design. Her late husband had been a carpenter who talked often about how stone churches in the old country kept their interiors warm even during blizzards, not because the stone generated heat, but because it changed the shape of the wind. John's notebooks, still in a trunk beneath the bed, were filled with sketches of arched walls, angled windbreaks, and something he called a solar wall, a south-facing stone barrier that trapped daytime warmth and released it slowly through the night. Nicole read those pages a dozen times, memorizing every measurement, every theory his hands had never lived to build. She knew she could not wait for a man to save her. She needed to become the builder herself. The problem was that dry stone masonry was backbreaking work that required a skill nearly extinct on the frontier. Farmers could nail boards, they could dig fence posts. They could not stack 2 tons of irregular fieldstone into a curved wall that would stand against a prairie gale without mortar. Nicole tried to hire help. She approached every able-bodied man in Bitter Creek, offering food, shelter, and a share of whatever the farm produced the following summer. One by one, they refused. A woman paying a man to work for her was unnatural. A woman who thought she could outsmart winter with a pile of rocks was insane. Behind her back, they called her the widow with a man's tongue, and they joked that the only stone she'd lay would be her own gravestone. Then someone mentioned Thomas Riley, the town drunk. Thomas had arrived in Bitter Creek 5 years earlier, quiet, solitary, with an accent that placed him somewhere in Ireland. He worked odd jobs for the first year, mending fences, digging wells, but something inside him had broken long before he reached Wyoming. He began drinking heavily after a bad winter that nobody discussed, and by 1873 he was living in the back corner of Fenton's livery stable, trading his last shreds of dignity for a flask of watered rye most mornings. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was soft and precise, like a man who had once known better words and chose to forget them. Nicole found him sitting against a hay bale on a Tuesday afternoon, staring at his own hands. She made her offer: meals, a dry bed in the barn, and no questions. In return, he would move stone for her, one season only. Thomas looked at her for a long time, his eyes bloodshot but steady. Then he nodded once. That was the beginning of a partnership that would baffle the entire valley. By the middle of September, the two of them had started digging the foundation trench for the first wall. Nicole worked beside him, hauling stones from the creek bed herself, while Thomas shaped the footing with an almost disturbing precision. The townspeople noticed immediately. A woman in a faded prairie dress, her dark hair tied in a low bun with loose strands whipping in the wind, side by side with the ragged drunk, building something that looked more like a fortress than a farm. Parker Jensen, the owner of the dry goods store, openly laughed from his wagon one afternoon. "You planning on keeping out the Sioux or the snow?" he shouted. Thomas didn't look up. Nicole kept working. That afternoon, she paid for a spool of measuring cord and a new hammer with the last coins from her husband's pocket. She would not explain herself to anyone. But even as the ridicule grew, something peculiar began to happen inside the construction site. Thomas Riley, without speaking, would run his fingers over each stone before placing it, feeling its weight, its curves, its hidden cracks. He never rushed. He never forced a rock into a gap it didn't fit. The walls rose slowly and they rose level. Each seemed tighter than anything built by the local farmers. Nicole watched his hands, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt the quiet shock of hope. This man was not simply moving stone. He was reading it. One evening, as the October chill began to harden the ground, a grizzled rancher named Elias Hart rode out to the Wren claim. Hart had survived more winters than anyone in Bitter Creek, and his opinion was treated like law. He studied the half-finished walls, the cleared trenches for what looked like buttresses, and the strange circular foundation Nicole had marked out with stakes. Then he turned to Nicole with a grave expression. "Stone won't stop a blizzard," he said. "It'll funnel the drift right against your door. I've seen it before. You're building your own coffin." Nicole looked at him, then at Thomas, who was methodically laying another course of stones in the dusk light. She thought about John's sketches, about the curved windbreaks and the solar walls, about the silent man who might be her only chance. "Maybe," she answered quietly. "Or maybe I'm building something this valley has never seen before." That night, the first hard frost of the season settled over the prairie. Inside the half-finished stone ring, the air was still and almost warm. Thomas stood alone by the wall, his breath misting in the darkness, and for the first time in years his hands did not shake. The season of testing was about to begin, and neither of them knew yet that the town's mockery would turn to shock before the first snow melted. The morning after that first hard frost, Thomas was already in the trench before sunrise. He did not speak. He rarely did. But his hands moved across the stones with a quiet certainty that Nicole found impossible to ignore. She had watched masons work back in Minnesota, practical men who stacked fieldstone into serviceable walls, chinking the gaps with mud and straw. Thomas did not chink. He did not fill gaps at all. He selected each rock as though the wall itself had already decided its shape, and his job was simply to listen. When a stone did not fit, he did not force it. He set it aside, ran his palm over the surrounding surface, and chose another. The seams between the rocks were so tight that even a knife blade could not slip between them. Nicole had seen her husband's sketches of dry stone cathedrals in Ireland and Scotland, structures that had stood for centuries without a drop of mortar. She began to understand that Thomas was not guessing. He was remembering. By the end of October, the first wall was nearly complete. It curved away from the north face of the cabin in a long, sweeping arc, like a cupped hand turned against the wind. The base was 3 feet thick, tapering as it rose to a height just above the cabin's roofline. But that was only the first layer of the design. Behind that wind wall, Thomas had laid out a second, smaller stone ring closer to the house, creating a narrow corridor between the two barriers. He called it the Dead Lane, and when Nicole asked its purpose, he knelt in the dirt and drew a faint diagram with a stick. Wind that broke against the outer wall would tumble upward, he explained. But some would curl back downward, and without the second ring, that downward curl would slam directly against the cabin door. The dead lane trapped that curling wind, stripping it of speed and snow before it could reach the house. Nicole stared at the diagram for a long moment. It was the same principle John had described in his notes, but Thomas had drawn it from memory alone. But the most astonishing feature was the sun house. On the south-facing slope, where the winter sun tracked low across the prairie, Thomas began stacking a long, low greenhouse from the same raw stone. The south wall was angled, not vertical, leaning slightly backward to catch the maximum light at noon. Inside, a deep bed of river sand and compost lay ready for winter vegetables. The roof would be layered with oiled canvas and a lattice of thin poles, but the real magic was the stone itself. By day, the dark rock absorbed heat. By night, it released that heat slowly into the enclosed space. If the design worked, Nicole would have fresh greens in February while the rest of Bitter Creek gnawed on hardtack and salted pork. The townspeople noticed that, too. Parker Jensen rode past one afternoon while Thomas was fitting the final course of the sun house wall. He pulled his wagon to a stop and laughed so hard the mule started. "A garden in January. Woman, you've lost your mind. That drunkard building you a tomb for cabbages." A few other farmers had gathered outside the dry goods store and joined the laughter, but one man did not laugh. Harold Finch, the valley's only surveyor, had spent time in the old country as a young man. He had seen the ancient glass houses of English estates, the orangeries that sheltered fruit trees through the winter. He studied the low stone structure, then looked at Thomas's hands, then looked back at the wall. He did not speak, but his expression had shifted from amusement to something far quieter. By the first week of November, the construction had taken on an almost unnerving rhythm. Thomas worked in silence, his body moving through the same precise motions hour after hour. Nicole hauled stones from the creek, now half frozen, her fingers raw beneath wool mittens. She noticed that Thomas's hands had stopped shaking entirely. His eyes had cleared. He ate his meals quietly but steadily, and the hollows in his cheeks had begun to fill. In the evenings, Nicole would sit by the fire reading John's notebooks, cross-referencing the sketches with the walls rising outside. She barely noticed the cold creeping into her own bones. There was too much work. The mortgage deadline hung over her like a blade, but for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something besides grief. Felt momentum. And then came the day of the first real storm. It was not the great blizzard everyone feared, not yet, but a hard, mean snow that swept down from the northern ridge on the 12th of November. The wind shrieked across the valley with enough force to rattle windows in town, and by nightfall 3-foot drifts had buried the main wagon trail. Inside the Wren claim, the walls were tested for the first time. Nicole stood at her cabin door, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the snow fly sideways. The outer wind wall did exactly what Thomas had predicted. The current struck the curved stone and slid upward, rolling over the top in a furious white plume that poured harmlessly downwind beyond the goat shed. But inside the dead lane, the air was almost still. A fine dusting of powder had settled there, no more. The cabin itself did not shudder. The roof did not groan. Nicole could hear the wind, but it sounded distant, baffled, like a dog locked outside a barn. The sun house was another matter. Around midnight, Nicole woke to a sharp crack. She threw on her coat and ran outside with a lantern, her heart pounding. One of the roof poles had snapped under the weight of wet snow that had drifted into an eddy behind the buttress. The canvas had ripped, and cold air was pouring into the greenhouse. The temperature inside had already dropped below freezing. If the seedlings froze, a full season of early planting would be lost. Thomas was already there, standing in the darkness, snow swirling around his head. He did not curse. He did not panic. He simply stared at the break, tracing the angle of the broken pole, then looking at the shape of the drift that had caused it. She saw his jaw tighten. He had miscalculated the rebound off the western hill. The wind was ricocheting in a way he had not anticipated, loading the far corner of the roof. Nicole helped him drag the frozen canvas back into place and prop the broken beam with a temporary brace. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, their breath fogging in the lantern light. When it was done, Thomas turned to her, his face half-lit, and spoke a single sentence that she would not forget. "Every wall teaches the next one what shape to take." Then he walked back to his bed in the barn without another word. The next day, Thomas redesigned the buttress. He dismantled the corner and rebuilt it with a sharper angle, a wedge that would split the rebound wind and send it sideways into the dead lane instead of against the roof. It took 3 days of bitter labor while the temperature kept dropping. Nicole watched the neighbors pass on the distant road, shaking their heads at the strange, stubborn widow and her silent laborer. But some of them had also noticed that while their own homes were buried in drifts that required hours of shoveling, the Wren cabin sat in a shallow basin of clear ground. Something was working. They could not yet admit what. A week later, on November 22nd, Elia's heart returned. This time he brought 2 other ranchers with him, men who had spent 30 winters on the frontier and had lost count of the livestock and friends they had buried under the snow. They did not laugh. They walked around the stone rings in silence, measuring the drift patterns with their eyes, kicking at the hard-packed snow where the wind had been redirected. Elia stood at the edge of the dead lane, removed his glove, and held his bare hand in the air inside the ring. He stayed like that for a full minute, feeling nothing but cold stillness. Then he looked at Nicole with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "You might just survive this winter," he said, "but the big one hasn't come yet." The big one always comes. By the second week of December, the air over Bitter Creek had turned to iron. The sky was the color of an old bruise, low and swollen, and the wind had vanished entirely. Old-timers recognized the held breath, the false peace that settled over the plains before a killing storm. Nicole checked the walls again and again. Thomas tightened every brace, packed additional snow against the outer base for insulation, and walked the perimeter a dozen times a day, stopping to feel the air currents with his palm. He had not touched a drop of whiskey since September, and his mind was as sharp as a blade, but his eyes held a shadow that Nicole could not read. Late one afternoon, as she brought him a cup of hot tea, he finally spoke more than a single sentence. "I built a cathedral once," he said quietly, staring at the stone wall. "In a county called Clare. The walls were 8 feet thick at the base, and the wind could scream for 3 days straight and never rattle the glass in the windows. But that was a long time ago." He did not finish the thought. Nicole did not press, but she understood enough. The cathedral builder was here, standing in the frozen dirt of a Wyoming homestead, his hands now steady on the very stone he had lost himself inside years ago. Then, on the night of December 15th, the temperature dropped so fast that water thrown into the air froze before hitting the ground. Nicole lit every lantern inside the cabin while the fire roared in the stove. The goats were locked tight in their shed, the greenhouse canvas battened down, the supply of split pine stacked inside the dead lane where it would stay dry. Thomas came to the cabin door and looked north, toward the ridge that had swallowed the sun. "It's coming," he said. And when Nicole looked past him toward the horizon, she saw the first pale wall of white sweeping toward them like the edge of the world folding inward. The blizzard hit at midnight with a sound like a train crossing a wooden bridge. Snow slammed against the outer stone wall with enough force to rattle the roof shingles, but the cabin itself barely trembled. Inside, the dead lane bled the wind of its fury, and the curved wall sent the heaviest drift climbing high overhead. Nicole sat at the table with John's notebooks open, her heart drumming against her ribs, while outside the great test of their labor began. If the stone held, she would keep her farm. If it failed, everything she loved would be buried by morning. Thomas sat by the door, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. For the first time in 5 years, he was praying. The storm did not pause for breath. For 2 full days, the blizzard scoured the valley with a white fury that erased every landmark, buried every fence line, and sealed every road under mountains of hard-packed drift. Inside the Wren cabin, time became a slow rhythm of firewood, prayers, and the muffled howl of a wind that could not reach them. The stone walls did not fail. They groaned under the shifting snow load, but they held. The dead lane filled gradually with fine powder that spilled over the inner wall in soft, harmless cones, never climbing high enough to block the door. In the sun house, the temperature dropped but stayed just above freezing, the dark stones radiating the stored heat of a long autumn back into the fragile seedlings. Nicole checked the thermometer at midnight on the second day and saw it holding at 34 degrees. Outside, the air was 40 below. By the third morning, the storm had exhausted its worst violence, but the aftermath was a landscape of frozen silence. The sun rose pale and distant, casting blue shadows across drifts that reached 15 feet in some hollows. Inside the Wren claim, the curved wind wall had sculpted the snow into a massive white rampart that arced around the homestead like the outer bailey of a medieval fortress. The drift climbed nearly to the top of the stone barrier, a frozen wave that would have buried any ordinary cabin, but the dead lane was clear enough to walk. The goat shed stood with a roof bare of snow. The chimney drew cleanly. Nicole pushed open the cabin door and stepped into air so still she could hear her own heartbeat. Thomas stood already at the outer wall, his hand resting against the cold stone, his breath clouding in the thin light. He looked at the massive drift he had taught the storm to build and said nothing for a long while. Then he turned to Nicole. "It held," he said. It was not pride in his voice. It was release. Nicole walked the perimeter slowly, cataloging every angle, every drift line, every place the wind had behaved as predicted. She stopped at the western buttress, the one that had failed in the earlier storm and been rebuilt at a sharper angle. There was no damage. The wedge had split the wind exactly as Thomas intended, bleeding snow into a low dune that curled away from the sun house roof. The seedlings inside were alive. Carrots, kale, and 3 rows of winter spinach had survived a 40-below night without a single pane of glass. She knelt in the cold soil and let the tears come, not from relief, but from the sudden understanding of just how close they had come to disaster. One miscalculation, one more mistake, everything would have ended. In town, the story was different. Bitter Creek had not been spared. The dry goods store lost half its roof to the wind. Parker Jensen's own house had drifted over the chimney, and his family spent 2 shivering days breathing smoke before he could dig an air shaft through the window. The livery stable where Thomas once slept collapsed under the snow load, killing 1 horse and trapping 3 others until Fenton could cut them free with a crosscut saw. Out on the plains, 2 homesteads north of the creek had vanished entirely beneath the drifts. Search parties later found the families alive but barely, huddled in root cellars with frost-bitten feet and empty stomachs. The valley had learned again what it always forgot in summer. Winter did not negotiate. Elia's heart rode out on the 4th day, as soon as the trail from his ranch could be broken. He did not come alone. With him were Harold Finch, the surveyor, a county assessor named Miller who had heard rumors, and a young newspaperman from Cheyenne named August Bell who smelled a story that might sell papers all the way to Chicago. They found Nicole shoveling a narrow path through the outer drift, while Thomas reset a few stones that had shifted slightly under the pressure. The sight stopped them cold. Elia stood in his stirrups and stared at the massive white wall curving around the cabin, perfectly shaped, as if the storm had been a mason itself. Finch dismounted and paced the dead lane twice, measuring with his eyes. The surveyor had once spent a year mapping the stone circles of England. He recognized the physics immediately. "Shear deflection," he muttered. "Wind-load absorption. This isn't a farm wall. This is a flying buttress turned backward." The newspaperman scribbled furiously. Parker Jensen arrived later that afternoon, his face still soot-streaked from the chimney disaster. He had come to mock, as always, but the words died in his throat. He saw the clear ground around the cabin. He saw the green shoots visible inside the sun house, alive in January. He saw Thomas, the town drunk, holding a stone hammer with the ease of a man who had done this work for decades. And then he saw the ledger. Nicole had left her mortgage papers on the cabin table, and when the men crowded inside to warm themselves by the stove, Jensen noticed the bank note. The payment was due in 2 weeks. The farm, if the storm had buried it, would have been worth nothing. Nicole would have lost everything. But now the land was the most valuable in the valley. That was when Thomas finally spoke the words that would reshape the town's memory. He was standing by the fire, his hands cupped around a tin mug, the lamplight catching the lines around his eyes. He did not look at anyone in particular. He just began to talk quietly, as if the story had been waiting a long time for permission to leave his chest. "I was born in a village called Kilfenora," he said. "My father was a stonecutter. My grandfather built the Abbey of Corcomroe. I was apprenticed to the guild at 12 and worked the cathedrals of Limerick and Ennis before I turned 20. When the famine took my wife and daughter, I crossed the ocean with nothing but a trowel and a broken heart. I landed in Boston and worked the quarries. I built a church in New York and a bank in Philadelphia. The stone here is different, but the rules are the same. Wind is just weight that moves." The silence that followed was absolute. Parker Jensen's face went pale as he remembered the times he had kicked Thomas awake in the stable, called him a worthless drunkard, thrown pennies at his feet for the amusement of the store crowd. Elia's heart removed his hat and held it against his chest, the gesture of a man at a funeral. The newspaper man stopped writing. He simply stared at Thomas, at the hands that had shaped a Wyoming storm into a cathedral wall, and understood that he had stumbled onto a story larger than any he had ever filed. Nicole stood in the corner, watching the men watch Thomas. She knew then that everything had changed. The joke was over. By the following week, word had spread through the valley faster than the frost had come. Every homesteader who had lost a barn roof or a cow to the drifts wanted to know how a woman and a drunk had survived without losing a single goat. They came in wagons, on horseback, trudging through the snow on foot. They brought questions and skepticism, and they left with sketches drawn in charcoal on scraps of paper. Nicole gave them no speeches. She simply walked them through the rings, showed them the dead lane, let them stand in the stillness and feel the wind break apart above their heads. Thomas, for his part, began to speak more than he had in years. He knelt in the snow and drew diagrams with a stick, explaining the angle of deflection, the ratio of wall height to drift accumulation, the necessity of an exit lane for the snow that did accumulate. The locals listened with a desperate attention because they had seen what the alternative looked like. No one called him a drunk anymore. They called him the Stone Man. Then came the offer that sealed the transformation. On the last day of January, a wealthy rancher named Silas Drummond sent his foreman to the Wren claim with a proposition. Drummond owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, and his winter losses had been catastrophic. Over 100 head frozen in the drifts, barns collapsed, a foreman injured. He had heard of the stone walls and the Sun House. He wanted Thomas and Nicole to design a similar system for his main ranch compound before the next winter. The payment would be enough to clear Nicole's mortgage entirely and leave a profit that could buy seed for 5 years. Nicole looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the stone wall, the one that had saved them, and then back at the foreman. "We'll need more stone," he said simply, and the foreman knew the deal was done. But the twist was not yet complete. That night, as Nicole sat by the fire adding figures to her ledgers, a knock came at the door. It was Harold Finch, the surveyor, holding a folded piece of paper. He had spent the past week researching the land claims and county records. What he had found was a detail no one had considered. The Wren claim sat on a seam of high-quality limestone that ran for nearly a mile along the creek bed. The same stone Thomas had been stacking all summer was not just fieldstone. It was premium building material, rare in this part of the territory, worth a small fortune if quarried properly. The very thing that had made the walls strong enough to split the wind also made the land itself valuable beyond farming, and Nicole owned every inch of it. As January gave way to February, the line of wagons at the Wren gate grew longer each day. Not just the desperate and the curious, but now the ambitious, the wealthy, the men who had once laughed at a widow's stone folly and now wanted the same magic for themselves. Thomas sketched designs late into the night. Nicole negotiated contracts with a steel spine she had not known she possessed. The mortgage was paid, the farm was secure, and the town drunk, the man everyone had written off as worthless, had become the most sought-after builder within 200 miles. The valley had not just been reshaped by the winter. It had been reshaped by a second chance that neither Nicole nor Thomas had expected to find in each other. What no one outside the claim yet understood, however, was the full scope of the revelation that would arrive with the spring thaw. A letter was already on its way from a cathedral architect in San Francisco who had seen the newspaper story about a mysterious Irish stonemason in Wyoming. And by the time the snow melted, the quiet man who had once slept in the livery stable would face a choice that would not only change his own life again, but would determine whether Nicole Wren kept her partner or lost him to the world that had once forgotten him. Spring came to Bitter Creek in the second week of March, not gently, but in a rush of meltwater and mud that turned every trail into a bog. The massive drifts that had entombed the valley began to shrink, exposing the wreckage they had hidden for months. South of the creek, the Jensen store roof lay in splinters. Fenton's rebuilt stable already sagged on a weak foundation. 3 homesteads had lost so much topsoil to wind scour that their fields looked like scraped bone. Families counted missing livestock and burned the last of their wet firewood. The winter had been cruel, and it had been honest about who was prepared and who was not. On the Wren claim, the thaw revealed something else entirely. As the snow retreated from the stone rings, the ground inside the dead lane was bare in patches, the soil already warming. The outer wind wall, which had seemed like a desperate gamble in October, now stood with the quiet permanence of something that had always belonged there. The Sun House had produced its first harvest in late February, spinach and young kale, enough to trade for coffee and flour at a premium. Nicole had kept her farm. But more than that, she had proved something that every rancher within 100 miles was now forced to admit. A woman, aided by a drunkard, had not only survived the worst blizzard in a decade, she had turned winter into an ally. The first major contract arrived on the last day of March. Silas Drummond, the cattle baron whose foreman had visited in January, rode out with a full retinue and a bank draft for $1,200. He wanted a complete windbreak system for his ranch headquarters, 6 outer walls, 2 sun houses, and a stone barn designed to the same principles. He wanted Thomas Riley to design it personally. Thomas studied the offer, his face unreadable, and then asked for a week to survey the land. He had not touched a drop of whiskey in 7 months. His hands were steady, his speech clear, and his reputation had transformed so completely that the same men who once crossed the street to avoid him now tipped their hats. Parker Jensen, humbled by his own ruined roof, came to the claim one afternoon with a bottle of good rye and an apology so awkward it was almost painful. "I was wrong about you," he told Thomas. "I was wrong about both of you." Thomas looked at the bottle, then at Jensen. "You can leave that on the post," he said. "I don't drink any more." Jensen nodded, his face a study in shame, and set the bottle down without another word. By nightfall, the bottle was still there, untouched. Then the surveyor, Harold Finch, returned with the second revelation. He had spent the winter corresponding with a geologist in Laramie, and the limestone seam that ran beneath the Wren claim was not merely high quality. It was part of a formation that extended only a few other places in the territory, all of them now controlled by railway and mining interests. A quarry on Nicole's land could supply building stone to half of Wyoming for decades. Finch presented his report with the quiet excitement of a man who understood the arithmetic. Nicole's 160 acres, once nearly worthless, were now worth more than $50,000 if developed. She could pay off her mortgage 100 times over. She could hire workers, expand the farm, build a school. She could do whatever she wanted. Nicole read the report by lantern light, her fingers tracing the numbers. Then she looked at Thomas, who sat by the fire sketching a new buttress design. "You knew the stone was good," she said. He nodded. "I knew on the first day. A mason knows stone like a farmer knows dirt. I picked this claim because of it." Nicole set the report down, the weight of its implications settling over her. The very thing that had made the walls strong enough to split the wind also made Thomas's presence here not random but intended. He had chosen her land. not by accident but by knowledge. The letter from San Francisco arrived on April 7th, carried by a courier who had ridden all the way from Cheyenne. It was written on heavy cream stationery, sealed with red wax, and signed by an architect named Reginald Thorne. Thorne had been commissioned to build the Cathedral of St. Bridget, a grand stone structure that would be the largest church west of the Mississippi. He had read the newspaper account of a mysterious Irish stonemason who had built a snow fortress in Wyoming, and he wanted Thomas Riley as his master mason. The salary was $3,000 a year, plus travel expenses, lodging, and a crew of 30 men to command. The offer was a resurrection. It was respect, wealth, and the kind of legacy that most craftsmen only dreamed of. Thomas read the letter 3 times. His face gave away nothing. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. "I need to think," he said. Nicole said nothing. She had known from the moment she understood his skill that the world would eventually call him back. She had just hoped it would take longer. For the next 4 days, Thomas worked in silence, surveying the Drummond Ranch site, measuring wind angles, sketching wall profiles in a small leather notebook. He spoke to no one about the letter, but Nicole saw him standing alone at the edge of the dead lane each evening, staring north toward the distant mountains, his hands clasped behind his back. She knew the shape of a man wrestling with his past. She had seen it in her own mirror after John died. On the 5th evening, she brought him a cup of tea and sat beside him on the cold stone wall. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "You gave me more than I ever had a right to ask. If the cathedral is where you belong, then go." Thomas looked at her, then back at the horizon. "I once believed I belonged to the stone," he said. "That nothing else mattered, not family, not home, not even my own life. But when the famine took everything, I learned that stone can be cold. It will stand long after you're gone, and it won't remember your name." He paused, the words heavy in the twilight air. "What we built here isn't just stone. It's a shelter for living people. It kept you alive. It kept me sober. I don't know if a cathedral can do that again." That night, Thomas wrote a reply to Reginald Thorne. He did not show it to Nicole before sending it back with the courier. The waiting was a kind of agony, not because Nicole feared his departure, but because she understood the magnitude of what he might sacrifice. The town watched, too. Word of the San Francisco offer had spread, and every rancher who had mocked Thomas the year before now held his breath. If the stone man left, who would teach them how to build the walls that could save their own families? The wind breaks, the sun houses, the dead lanes, all of it might vanish with him. Elia's heart rode out one afternoon and found Thomas setting the foundation for a new buttress at the Drummond site. He stood for a long moment, then spoke with a bluntness that had defined his entire life. "That letter," he said, "you'd be a fool to take it." Thomas looked up from the stone. "Why?" Elias removed his hat and rubbed the back of his neck, a rare gesture of discomfort. "Because here, you're needed, and a man who's needed doesn't walk away unless he's still running from something." It was the closest thing to wisdom the old rancher had ever spoken. Thomas nodded slowly, then resumed his work. In the last week of April, the weather turned warm enough for a barn raising at the Drummond spread. Dozens of families gathered, not just to help, but to learn. Thomas stood in the center of a crowd, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining the angle of deflection and the necessity of an exit lane for snow. Men who had never held anything but a hammer began to understand the physics of wind. Women who had lost gardens to frost asked about sun houses. Nicole moved among them, answering questions about planting rotations and the cost of stone, her voice steady and assured. She was no longer the widow with a man's tongue. She was a partner in a venture that was rapidly becoming legendary. And then, on the final day of April, a second letter arrived. Not from San Francisco, but from a town council in Laramie. They had heard of the Wren wind walls and wanted Thomas and Nicole to design a public snow barrier for their main street, a project that would be funded by the territorial government. The offer was twice the money of the Drummond contract and would establish them as the foremost builders of their kind in the region. It was, in its own way, as great an honor as any cathedral. Nicole read the letter aloud to Thomas in the cabin that evening. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew the reply he had sent to Thorne, now returned with a small note of acknowledgement. "I told him no," Thomas said. "I told him I'm building a different kind of cathedral out here, one that saves lives instead of just souls." The revelation landed on Nicole like a physical weight, not heavy but firm, settling into place. She understood then that Thomas had chosen not merely to stay, but to commit entirely to the land, to the work, to the partnership they had forged through hunger and frost. He was not a man fleeing his past anymore. He was a man who had found something worth building for the future. In the warm spring light, with the letter from Laramie on the table and the stone walls standing silent outside, Nicole felt the last knot of grief in her chest begin to loosen. She had lost a husband and gained something impossible, a second chance, built from the same stone that had nearly crushed her. By early summer, the Wren Stone Works was operating with a crew of 8 men, all trained by Thomas. The limestone quarry opened on the south slope, producing building blocks that were hauled to homesteads across the territory. Every wall they built carried the same curved, wind-deflecting profile, and every sun house followed the angled design that had saved Nicole's winter garden. The valley began to change. Not all at once, but season by season, the desperate cycle of winter ruin was broken. Families who would have fled back east stayed. New settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of a place where someone had finally figured out how to survive. And at the center of it all stood the original stone ring around the Wren cabin, still holding steady, still teaching the wind where to break. The final surprise, the detail that even Nicole had not anticipated, came from the newspaperman August Bell. He had spent the spring compiling his notes into a long feature for a Chicago magazine. The story, titled The Stone Widow and the Cathedral Mason, was published in June and circulated widely across the country. It told the full truth. The widow who refused to sell, the drunk who was a master builder, the winter that nearly killed them, and the improbable victory they had carved from frozen ground. Within weeks, letters poured in from architects, engineers, and farmers in Minnesota, Dakota, and even Canada, all asking for the specifications of the Wren wind walls. Thomas's diagrams, simple and precise, began appearing in agricultural journals. The design went viral in the slow, inexorable way of the 19th century, spreading from hand to hand, farm to farm, territory to territory. One afternoon, as Nicole stood on the porch watching a wagon train pass on the distant road, she realized something that made her laugh aloud. The men in that wagon were carrying stone from her quarry, drawn from the limestone that had once seemed like a curse. The valley she had fought to keep was no longer just her home. It was the seed of something larger, a quiet revolution in how the frontier lived with winter. And Thomas, the man she had hired with nothing but meals and a dry bed, was standing beside her with a hammer in his hand and a calm in his eyes that had not been there on the first day. He had not only built walls against the cold. He had built himself back from ruin, one stone at a time. But the story was not yet over. For all the success, for all the letters and contracts and newspaper fame, a single question still hung unanswered between them, one that would not be resolved until the first snow of the following winter. Would the design hold again, or had they simply been lucky once? The question that lingered after that first impossible winter was not whether the walls would hold a second time. The walls were stone, and stone endures. The deeper question, the one that settled into the minds of everyone who heard the story, was about the people who built them. How had a woman the town dismissed, and a man the town discarded managed to accomplish what no one else had even attempted? The answer was not simply skill, though Thomas Riley's hands carried centuries of cathedral knowledge. And it was not simply stubbornness, though Nicole Wren had refused to be buried by grief or snow. The answer was that they had seen each other clearly when the rest of the world had chosen blindness. The town saw a widow who didn't know her place and a drunk who had lost his. They saw two broken people who could not possibly succeed, because success required the kind of wholeness that seemed absent in both of them. But what the winter proved was that broken pieces, fitted together with patience and precision, can form something stronger than any single unbroken stone. In the years that followed, the Wren Stoneworks grew into one of the most respected building firms in the territory. The wind walls and sun houses they designed became standard features on homesteads from the Dakotas to Montana, quietly saving thousands of families from the annual catastrophe of winter. Thomas Riley never returned to cathedral building, but he trained a generation of masons who carried his methods even further west. Nicole Wren's farm became a demonstration site where settlers came to learn not just construction, but a new way of thinking about the land. The limestone quarry that Harold Finch discovered provided stone for schools, courthouses, and railroad bridges. The two of them, the widow and the drunk, became proof that the frontier did not only reward muscle and noise. Sometimes it rewarded the quiet ones who listened to the wind instead of fighting it. But the story also carries a warning. For every Thomas Riley who gets a second chance, how many others remain sleeping in stables, their gifts unseen and their stories untold? The world is full of people who have been written off as worthless because their value is buried beneath failure or sorrow or the long, slow erosion of hope. Nicole took a risk that no one else would take, and in doing so, she unlocked a treasure that had been hiding in plain sight. The question is not whether such treasures exist. They do. The question is whether we have the eyes to recognize them when they stand before us, ragged and quiet, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And as for the walls themselves, they stood. The following winter brought a blizzard even fiercer than the first, and the stone rings around the old Wren cabin turned back the wind with the same calm certainty. By then, the town no longer called it luck. They called it design. The storm still howled across Bitter Creek every January, but the shape of the valley had changed. A new architecture had taken root, one that didn't try to beat winter by brute force but taught it where to break. And at the center of it all, a weathered stone wall still curved like a cupped hand against the north, still holding the silence that a dead lane of still air had carved from the prairie gale. That silence was the real monument. It was the sound of a second chance, built one stone at a time. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that hidden genius deserves to be found and second chances deserve to be told, then subscribe and share this video. Someone in your life might need to hear that the thing the world calls worthless might just be the most valuable stone in the wall.